A small, wiry Irish woman in a faded dust-gray calico dress and a wide, flat black straw hat stood at the rim of a stacked stone well curb on the south edge of a dry playa lake on the hot Texas morning of the 5th of August, 1855. And she lowered a wooden bucket on a plaited oxhide rope into the throat of the well and heard the sweet splash of the bucket striking the water 47 feet below. The well had been hand-dug by a single woman through 6 feet of caliche, 13 feet of fossiliferous Permian limestone, 4 feet of gray clay shale, and 24 feet of softer limestone in 43 days, with a single iron spade and a forged rock bar made from that spade, lit by tallow candles and ventilated by a second shaft 8 paces north, rigged with a sailcloth wind vane. A Tennessee freighter named Caleb Witherspoon rode in at noon with 3 pack mules and an empty barrel, and laid a silver $50 on the curb. The Irish woman, whose name was Hannah Crowe, looked at the $50 a long moment and poured the clear cold water into a tin trough. This was Hannah Crowe of Crowe's Well, 18 miles west of the Texas military camp at the head of the Colorado River and 47 miles east of the Pecos. She was 38. She had been born Hannah Boyle in the slate and limestone parish of Killaloe in Tipperary in the spring of 1817, the only daughter of a parish stonemason named Diarmuid Boyle and his wife, Brundage. Her father had laid the chancel arch of the small Catholic chapel at Killaloe in 1822 and had taught his daughter from the age of 7 to read a limestone bed by the color of its weathering and the depth of its bedding planes, to feel a true plumb with a string and lead weight, and to set a stone broad face down. Hannah had emigrated from Cobb Harbor on the St. Bridget in the autumn of 1841 with her mother's brass crucifix and a small canvas trunk, and reached New Orleans in November of that year. She met Cormac Crowe at St. Patrick's Church in the immigrant quarter of New Orleans in 1842 and married him in 1843. Cormac was a journeyman carpenter from Galway, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with gray eyes and a soft Galway voice, who built clapboard houses along the levee. They had 3 small children in the first 3 years of their marriage: Padraig in the autumn of 1843, Brigid in the spring of 1844, and Neve in the early summer of 1846. The great yellow fever summer of 1846 came down on the immigrant quarter in the second week of August, and the 3 small Crowe children were lost in 9 days, and they were laid in the Catholic cemetery at Saint Roch. Hannah walked the 3 small graves every Sunday afternoon for the 9 years after the summer of the fever, with her mother's brass crucifix in her hand and a small bunch of paper white flowers from the levee, and she had not had another child since. In the spring of 1855, Hannah 38 and Cormac 45, they sold the small clapboard house on the levee and joined the Brundage emigrant train out of Fort Smith, bound for Tucson by way of the Southern Emigrant Trail. The train was 9 wagons strong, led by an old Tennessee farmer named Captain Ezekiel Brundage, 66, lean and slow of speech, with his wife Esther, who was 62 and quiet. The train doctor was an Indianan named Marcus Lott, 40. The train carried the Hightower family, whose mother Jemima was 47 and the kindest woman in the company, with her husband Silas, a Methodist lay preacher. The Jenkins family had 3 small boys, the Thornhill family 2 girls and an infant, and a pair of widower brothers named Eli and Asahel Pratt drove the rear wagon. The Crowes had a single wagon with a canvas cover, 2 oxen named Saint and Sinner, and the small canvas trunk that had crossed the ocean from Cobb Harbor 14 years before. The train left Fort Smith on the 11th of March, 1855, and followed the southern emigrant trail by the head of the Red River and across the oak savannas of North Texas. The train crossed at San Antonio in early April, and the Crowes stayed a week to lay in dry stores at the freighter Maximilian Vasquez's General Goods on the Plaza de las Islas. Cormac took his water from a small wooden barrel in the corner of the storeroom on the third day, and the fever was on him by the fourth. He could not sit his wagon out of San Antonio. Hannah laid him in the wagon bed on the straw tick with the canvas drawn back for the air, walked beside the wagon for the next 400 miles west, and said the rosary aloud every evening beside the wagon while Cormac shivered under the buffalo robe. The fever climbed in the second week and held high through the third. By the fifth week, it had taken the sight from his eyes by inches, and he could no longer make out the canvas wagon bow above him. The Brundage train made the south rim of the Llano Estacado on the 16th of April, 1855, and camped at a small dry playa lake. Dr. Marcus Lott came to the Crowe wagon at sundown, laid his ear at Cormac's chest, and said quietly that he did not see Cormac through 3 more days, and the train could not wait because the Pecos was still 47 miles west, and their water was down to 4 barrels. It would be kinder to leave them here than carry a sick man across the dry country in a jolting wagon. Captain Brundage came at full dark with his hat in his hand and said in his slow Tennessee voice that the train would leave 1 wagon, both oxen, 18 pounds of cornmeal, 4 pounds of dry bacon, a half-keg of salted pork, a bucket, the iron spade and felling axe, the percussion-cap shotgun and 11 cartridges, and 80 feet of hemp rope. The train would pull out at sunrise. He said he was sorry and did not lift his eyes. Mrs. Jemima Hightower came at 4 in the morning of the 17th with a tin cup of warm sage tea for Cormac and a small leather-bound book of psalms for Hannah, and sat on the wagon tongue an hour and said in her soft Tennessee voice that she had argued with the captain 3 hours and her husband Silas 3 hours after, and the captain had not been moved. She set her own brown wool shawl in Hannah's lap, and a half-pound of dry beans hidden in her sewing kit in Hannah's hand. Said she would speak Hannah's name in her prayers every evening of the rest of the road, and walked back to her own wagon in the pale dawn. The Brundage train pulled out at sunrise. 9 wagons rolled west in single file with a dust column rising in the cool blue dawn. Hannah watched the last wagon pass the western rim at 20 minutes past 6, watched the dust column thin and lower until she could not make it out against the rim of the world. She turned to the wagon and laid her hand on Cormac's brow and said his name once. He moved his lips and said her name back. She lifted the canvas at the south side and tied it back for the morning air, walked the 80 paces down to the playa floor, and said a quiet decade of the rosary against the pale dawn sky. The first thing she did was walk the south rim of the dry playa with a hackberry Y-rod cut at the south end with the felling axe. Her father, Diarmuid Boyle, had cut a Y-rod of hackberry for the parish well at Killaloe in 1827 when she had been 10, and he had said in his quiet Tipperary voice that he did not believe in the rod, but that there was no harm in walking the ground with a stick of green wood if a man kept his eyes open. Hannah walked the rim 3 hours with the Y-rod loose in her hands and her eyes on the ground. She found a faint dip in the caliche bench, 23 paces north of the rim, where the prairie grass grew slightly taller and greener than the grass along the rim itself. The dip was the shape of an old water seep, where the playa had run over the rim in some past wet year. She marked it with a pile of 3 stones from the playa floor. She began to dig at sunrise on the 18th of April, 1855. The first 6 feet was red caliche topsoil with small fossil shells and broken limestone, and the iron spade worked it cleanly. She lifted the spoil out with the wooden bucket on the hemp rope, knotted to a length of cottonwood lashed across the rim as a windlass bar. She dug 8 hours the first day and 7 the second, and at the end of the second, the hole was 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. She had blistered both hands by the end of the first day, and the blisters had broken and bled into her calico by the end of the second. She wrapped her hands with strips of linen torn from her own undershift. She did not stop. She fed Cormac a thin broth of cornmeal and salt pork twice a day on a tin spoon, and said the rosary every evening on the wagon tongue, and Cormac moved his lips along with her in his fever. On the 19th, she hit the first shelf of Permian limestone at the bottom of the 6-foot hole. The limestone was hard, pale gray rock with small fossils of brachiopods and ammonites in it. The iron spade rang against it and could not bite. She climbed out at noon, remembered the small forge of her father at Killaloe, set the iron spade head against the wagon iron, built a small fire of broken buffalo chips, and laid the spade head into the fire for an hour. She lifted it out glowing red, beat it on the wagon iron with a flat river stone her father had given her as a child, and worked it 3 hours into a 4-foot iron rock bar with a single chisel point. She cooled the rock bar in the wooden bucket that night. She worked the rock bar against the Permian limestone for the next 7 days. She would lower herself at sunrise, set the chisel point against the limestone bedding plane, lift the rock bar and bring it down with the full weight of her 4.5 stones, and the rock bar would bite the limestone 1/2 inch at a stroke. She chipped the limestone into flat pieces and hoisted them out on the windlass bar. By the end of the 7th day, the 26th of April, the hole was 13 feet deep, and she had broken through into a softer band of gray clay shale. She picked up 2 small fossil shells that evening. One was a brachiopod the size of her thumbnail. The other was a spiral ammonite the size of a silver dollar with the soft inner curve of a sleeping child. She put the ammonite into the breast pocket of her calico beside her mother's brass crucifix and carried it there for the rest of her long life. She worked 4 feet of gray clay shale the next day with the rock bar and spade together. At sundown of the 27th, she came up and walked the 80 paces to the wagon and could not lift her arms above her shoulders. Cormac was asleep under the buffalo robe. She laid her head against the wagon tongue, watched the first 3 stars come up over the eastern rim, said the memorare into the pale evening, and went down again at sunrise. She heard the small string of mules on the south horizon at 4 in the afternoon of the 30th of April. She climbed the rope and watched 5 mules cross the playa at a slow, tired walk with a single rider on a dark bay gelding behind them. The rider was a young man, perhaps 28, with a soft brown face under a wide, flat black sombrero and a brown wool serape across his shoulders. He took off his sombrero and said in slow, careful English that he was Tomás Mariscal of Ceboleta in New Mexico Territory, of the Mexican Comanchero traders, bound east for the salt pans below the head of the Colorado, and that he had seen the smoke from her buffalo chip fire at noon. Hannah lifted her hands, wrapped to the wrists in soft strips of linen and red with rock shale, and said quietly that the playa had been dry 8 months, and she was 13 feet down where the rod had hung true, and would find the water in a fortnight. Tomas Mariscal did not water his mules at the dry playa. He tied them to the south wagon wheel, walked to the rim of the hole, looked down the 13-foot throat, turned and looked at the wagon and the canvas tied back, and at Cormac Crowe under the buffalo robe, and he set his sombrero on the wagon tongue and said he would stay 7 days. He stayed 7. On the first, he butchered a small wild turkey he had shot 2 miles south, and Hannah ate the first hot meat she had eaten in 25 days, and gave the broth to Cormac on a tin spoon. On the second, he cut a long, stiff length of sotol stem from a clump at the south end of the playa, and plaited the strips into a stout new 50-foot rope for the windlass, because the hemp had begun to fray on the limestone shelf. He showed Hannah the plait, and she learned it in an hour. On the fourth, he worked the rock bar in the throat 6 hours and chipped 14 inches of the softer second limestone out of the bottom, while Hannah hoisted spoil above him. On the 7th, he mounted his bay gelding, said he would come back at the new moon of June, and that he had a friend among the Tonkawa scouts at the abandoned Fort Phantom Hill post, who was a good man with a long-handled shovel. The throat of the well stood at 23 feet deep on the morning of the 7th of May, when Mariscal rode east. Hannah worked the rock bar alone the next 14 days against the softer second limestone, and at sundown of the 20th, the throat stood at 35 feet, and she could no longer make out the rim from the bottom without a tallow candle. She had brought down 4 tallow candles in a tin pot, lit one at a time from a small box of lucifer matches she had hoarded since New Orleans, and set each on a ledge of cut limestone chiseled into the south wall at 4-foot intervals. By the evening of the 20th, she had 9 candle ledges and was lighting 2 at a time. The air at the bottom was warm and still and faintly metallic with the smell of broken limestone. The mid-morning of the 21st of May was the morning the candle went out. She had lowered herself at sunrise and begun to work the rock bar against the bottom shelf at 41 feet. The candles burned steady for an hour. At 9:15, the lower candle went out. She lit it again from the upper candle. It flickered and went out a second time. The upper candle began to flicker low. Her breath came short. She felt at the back of her throat the small, sharp, sweet taste that her father Diarmuid Boyle had told her in the parish stoneyard at Killaloe in 1828 was the taste of the bad air at the bottom of a deep new well. She did not panic. She set the rock bar against the south wall, took the upper candle in her left hand, set her right hand on the rope, and climbed at a steady, measured pace. She came out in under 4 minutes, sat on the curb with her chest heaving and the upper candle still flickering low in her left hand, and said quietly that the well had bad air at the bottom and would not let her in. She sat at the rim an hour and thought on what her father had told her at Killaloe 27 years before. He had said the deep new wells of the parish sometimes filled at the bottom with the bad air of the old rock, and the way of the parish stonemasons was to dig a second shaft alongside the main, 6 feet wide and 9 feet deep, rig a sailcloth wind vane above it to push the surface wind down, and cut a horizontal tunnel at the bottom into the main shaft, so the wind would flow down the second shaft and across the bottom of the main shaft and up out, and the bad air would lift out with the flow. He had called the second shaft the donkey shaft. She marked the donkey shaft 8 paces north of the main rim that afternoon and dug it the next 3 days. It was 6 feet wide at the rim and 9 feet deep at the floor, in caliche topsoil only. On the morning of the 23rd, she chiseled a horizontal tunnel, 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, through the caliche to the main shaft, 8 paces long, breaking through into the south wall at the 35-foot mark. She climbed up that evening and rigged a sailcloth wind vane above the donkey shaft from canvas cut from the wagon cover, set on a tripod of split cottonwood. She lit a tallow candle on the morning of the 24th and lowered it down on a sotol stem rope. The candle burned bright and steady at the 40-foot ledge. The bad air was gone. On the morning of the 24th, Hannah sat on the curb at sunrise and did not climb down. She had built the donkey shaft and the wind vane, had not eaten more than a tin spoon of cornmeal broth in 5 days, had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in a fortnight, and her right hand had stiffened so she could not close it on the rock bar without a sharp pain in the 3rd joint of her ring finger. She thought of walking east. The headwaters of the Colorado of Texas were 2 and 20 miles east, and a wagon trace ran along the north bank that bore some traffic at this season. If she left Cormac with the canvas tied back for the air and a bucket of water at his hand, she could be at the trace in 3 days, and a freighter might come back for him, and she would not have to lift the rock bar again. She sat 2 hours. The morning sun lifted clear of the eastern rim, and the heat began to climb. She heard a thin voice from the wagon under the canvas. It was Cormac in his fever dream, and he said her name, and said it again, more clearly, and then he said, "A store." Hannah kissed the small steel band of her wedding ring, stood from the curb, set her right foot on the sotol stem rope, and went down into the well. She worked the rock bar against the bottom shelf the next 4 days, and the second limestone bottomed out at 45 feet on the morning of the 28th. At noon, in a faint band of softer gray rock below the second limestone, the chisel point broke through into a small underground water seep, and a slow brown trickle ran across the floor and pooled at her boots. She set the rock bar against the south wall, set both her wrapped hands on her face, sat down on the limestone floor of the well, and wept quietly a quarter of an hour. She climbed the rope to the rim, sat at the curb in the noonday sun, said the memorare aloud, and said her father Diarmuid Boyle's name, her mother Breed's name, the names of Padrig and Brigid and Niev, and the name of Cormac Crowe. The water was brackish on the 28th and 29th, with a thin, sour mineral taste. She dug 3 more feet on the 31st and the 1st of June, and the water came clearer. She lined the bottom 6 feet with a stacked stone curb of the limestone she had pulled out, 3 courses without mortar, broad face down as her father had taught her at Killaloe, and the water filtered through the curb. The water ran clear and cold and sweet on the morning of the 3rd of June, 1855. She raised the first sweet bucket at 7:30, carried it the 80 paces to the wagon, soaked a clean cotton cloth in the cold water, and sat at the wagon bed beside Cormac and washed his face and his eyes and his thin, gray bearded jaw. Cormac lifted his hand from the buffalo robe, laid it on her wrist, and said in his quiet Galway voice that he could feel her at his face. He could not see her. He could not see the cotton cloth. He could not see the canvas wagon bow. The fever had broken on the 2nd of June, but the sight had not come back into his gray eyes. Tomas Mariscal rode back to the south rim at sundown of the 7th of June with his 5 mules and his bay gelding, and a Tonkawa scout from the abandoned Fort Phantom Hill post named Wagon. Wagon was 35, with a thin-lined, sunburnt face under a flat-brimmed felt hat and an eagle feather at the band, and carried a long-handled shovel lashed to his pack saddle. Marisol dismounted, walked to the curb, looked down the throat, laughed once into the warm dusk air, and said the small Irish woman had cut a well into the south rim of the Llano Estacado, where there had been no water for 100 miles. Wagon walked the south rim an hour at sundown, came back at full dark, and said in slow, careful English that there was a grass fire on the south horizon set by the dry lightning of the afternoon, and the south wind would bring it across the playa by morning. Mariscal and Wagon worked the fire break through the night of the 7th and the small hours of the 8th, cutting 40 paces wide around the wagon and the well with shovel, axe, and spade, and wetting down the sod walls of the small dugout Hannah had begun with 5 buckets of well water. The grass fire crossed the southern rim at 6:30 on the morning of the 8th, crowned the rim, and ran north an hour, and passed the wagon at 40 paces, and a heat that scorched the canvas. It did not take the wagon. Saint, the smaller of the 2 oxen, was lost to the smoke at noon. They buried Saint at the south rim that afternoon. The Crowes had 1 ox after the 8th of June. Mariscal and Wagon stayed with the Crowes 22 days and built the small sod dugout on the south rim 3 paces from the well. It was 12 feet square and 7 feet at the ridgepole, set into the south slope with a packed sod wall on the south and a split cottonwood door on the north. Wagon laid the sod walls broad face down, in the manner Hannah's father had taught her with limestone at Killaloe, and she said it was good work. They carried Cormac into the dugout on the evening of the 29th of June, and laid him on a fresh straw tick on the packed earth floor, and Cormac felt the cool earth walls with his thin hands, and said the dugout was a sound build. Mariscal rode west with his mules and Wagon on the morning of the 30th, bound for Ceboleta, and said he would come back at the new moon of September with pinto beans and dry corn and an iron cook stove. The first traveler on the south rim after the Brundage train was Caleb Witherspoon of Tennessee, who rode in at noon of the 5th of August. He paid a silver $50 for 2 buckets of water for his mules and his barrel, and carried back to the head of the Colorado the word of the small Irish well. By the new moon of September, 6 parties of southern route freighters and emigrants had passed through, and each had paid the $50. By November, the dugout had a name in the freighters' talk. It was Crowe's Well. By May 1856, the well had a swing-arm pump on the curb, paid for by the freighters of the trail, a wooden trough for the mules, and a flat slab of caliche set at the rim with the date carved into it by Tomas Mariscal, the 17th of April, 1855 to the 3rd of June, 1855. Cormac Crowe sat on the split cottonwood bench at the south wall of the dugout through the autumn and winter of 1855 and the spring of 1856, and the sight did not come back into his gray eyes. He learned the layout of the dugout and the curb of the well by the careful touch of his thin hands. He laid his right hand on the door and counted 7 paces north to the curb, laid his left hand on the curb and counted 80 paces south to the wagon, and walked the ground without falling by the start of autumn 1855. Hannah led him by the right hand the first 2 months of his blindness. After that, Cormac walked alone, and he laid small, flat slabs of caliche along the 80 paces to mark the path. He took up the split cottonwood pump handle on the curb in the spring of 1856 and pumped a bucket for every freighter that came through, and said his own name aloud to each, and Hannah's name aloud to each, and the Southern Emigrant Trail learned the names of the Crowes. The Crowes had a small son on the 7th of March, 1858, in the sod dugout on the South Rim, a thin, pale-haired infant with his father's gray eyes and his mother's small Tipperary mouth. They named him Marcus Thomas Crowe. Marcus for the doctor who had said Cormac would not see 3 more days, and Thomas for the Comanchero trader who had come back at the new moon of June 1855 and stayed 22 days. Mrs. Esther Brundage, widow of Captain Ezekiel Brundage, who had passed at Tucson in the autumn of 1856 of a slow lung fever, rode east in the 3rd week of June 1859, 4 years and 2 months after the train had left the Crowes at the South Rim. She rode in at sundown of the 18th on a small gray mare with a freighter's wagon behind her and knocked at the split cottonwood door. Hannah opened the door with the small boy, Marcus Thomas Crowe, at her hip. Mrs. Brundage took off her hat and said in her quiet Tennessee voice that she was sorry for the morning of the 17th of April, 1855. Hannah stood at the door a quarter of an hour and did not speak. The boy laid his thin hand on her neck. Hannah said quietly she had heard the apology, said the well was open to any traveler who could pay the $50, and Mrs. Brundage was welcome to water her gray mare and fill her barrel, and that the dugout door would close at sundown. Cormac Crowe lived 39 more years at the south rim of Crowe's Well. He passed at the dugout in 1894 of a slow lung fever at the age of 84, laid in a small grave at the south rim with a slab of caliche cut by Mariscal's grandson at Ceboleta. Hannah lived on at the south rim 28 more years, and the well stood through the cattle drive years and the railroad years and the Great War, and the water stayed clear and cold. Marcus Thomas Crowe took up the pump handle in his father's place in 1881 and worked the curb 46 years after. Hannah Crowe was interviewed in the dugout in 1922 at the age of 500 by a young Texas folklore collector named John Avery Lomax, and she told him the well had been hand-dug in 43 days, that the bad air had come at 41 feet on the 21st of May, that the donkey shaft had carried it out, that the water had run clear on the 3rd of June, and that her husband had said her name on the morning of the 24th, and she had gone back down. Hannah was laid at the South Rim in October 1922 beside Cormac. The well stood through the dust storms of the 1930s and the drought of the 1950s, and the water ran clear as late as 1953, when a small bronze Texas historical marker was set 3 paces north of the curb. In spring of 1968, the dugout was lifted from the South Rim and carried to the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum at Canyon, Texas, and it stands there to this day beside the hackberry Y-rod, the forged iron rock bar, and the spiral ammonite the size of a silver dollar from the breast pocket of a small, wiry Irish woman who had once stood at the rim of a hand-dug well on the cool blue morning of the 17th of April, 1855.